Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this second Zoom event organised by the Geneva Literary Aid Society, GLAS, as it's better known. We had a great Monday night last week with Pádraig Rooney from Monaghan, and we're happy to keep this going. We'd like to thank everybody who made a donation to the Edith Wilkins Foundation for Street Children last week. They much appreciated it. As you know, the children that we support there in Darjeeling are under lockdown at the moment, and they're finding it quite difficult to make ends meet as a lot of their normal sources of funding have dried up. So thanks everybody. If you can keep up that support to them, it'll be much appreciated. So tonight it's my great pleasure to welcome John McEntee to the GLAS Hour, as we're calling it. And John has written a marvellous account of his life, not just his life in journalism, but also an account of his childhood growing up in County Cavan in Ireland. John, can you hear me?
I hear you. Can you hear me?
I can. You're very welcome, John. It's great to have you on the webinar.
Pleasure.
Perhaps we could start by asking you, how is Boris?
I think he's much iller than he's pretending. You know, he looked wretched. He did a video from Downing Street the other night, and he's not in great form. He's only 55, which it is probably in the lower sort of range of the people who are getting this dreadful lurgy. But the point is that a lot of people are asking questions. How can you run a government from a hospital bed? He's in St. Thomas's Hospital, ironically, just across the road, just across the river from the Houses of Parliament. And the feeling is he's not well. I don't think it's critical. I don't think it's terminal, but it's certainly not healthy for a prime minister suffering from this ill and trying to control the government and trying to sort of rally people during this awful time.
Absolutely. John, do you have any advice for people trying to survive this lockdown, how they should go about writing a memoir? How did you come up with the idea to? Well,
you know, writing a memoir is my idea of writing a memoir at the time was I just thought I'd like to sort of put down a lot of my childhood experiences rather than, you know, sort of the journalistic side of it. And I remember I used to be in Fleet Street for the Irish Press, the long gone Irish Press, with a tiny little cubbyhole of an office, and we shared the building with Maeve Binchy, who was then the Irish Times star writer. And Maeve was a wonderful lady. I mean, she passed away. She was a hugely successful writer. But at this stage, we're talking in the late 70s, Maeve was just a journalist. We used to meet at interviews. And, you know, I remember sort of being scooped by her a couple of times when there were sort of stars in from Hollywood. And but Maeve always enjoyed going and having a very well-refreshed lunch. And like the rest of us, she just enjoyed the whole camaraderie of Fleet Street. And then out of the blue, she suddenly appeared with a book called Light a Penny Candle, which is a huge seller, and it set her up as one of the world's great writers. And I said to Maeve, when did you write this book? You're always, you know, you've always got a gin and tonic in your hand at noon, and you enjoy a liquid lunch. And she said, what I've been doing is, she lived in Olympia with her husband Gordon, and she said, I get up at 5 in the morning, and she was writing from 5 until sort of 9:30. She usually came in on the tube, you know, from Olympia at about for 10 o'clock, and she bought this book out almost secretly, and it became a huge seller. And it made me think, well, that's the thing to do, you know. Don't tell anybody you're writing a book, because, you know, it's that great old Irish adage, you know, the one, I think it was in Toners and McDade, somebody said, I'm writing a book, and the guy said to next to it, neither am I, because nobody was writing books. So basically, I decided that I would replicate that. I'd get up really early in the morning at 5 and just jot down memoirs of my childhood, and then onwards to, so I wrote it in about 3 months. I mean, it was very, very quick, because once you get going, it's almost like a journalist giving yourself a deadline.
I find it hard to believe, John, that you wrote this in 3 months. Well,
yeah, I mean, the thing is, you just churn it out, and in fairness, the manuscript that I presented to the publishers, you know, needed a lot of I mean, there was a lot of work after that in terms of they wanted to sort of realign it, and they wanted to, there were things they wanted taken out. But it was a 3-month sort of epic in writing it intensely. And I was saying earlier, I think that my notion in this lockdown of people who do want to write would be to start with maybe a diary of this awful sort of isolation we're all suffering right through Europe and the rest of the world. And maybe just sit down and just write some thoughts on this isolation, then say, oh, what year is it now? It's 2020. What was I doing 10 years ago? And then sort of get into a notion of maybe retrospective diary of what you were doing. Unless you want to write a novel, which is a completely different.
So how many hours a day would you have spent on the memoir?
Well, I've probably, as I said, probably 5, maybe four a day. And in fact, it gets more exciting as you get into it. You realize that, you know, you are actually, you know, you haven't got writer's block, because the trick is always to leave it with a story that is in your head. But if you put it down, you'll suddenly be stumped. So then when you go back to the manuscript, you're immediately engaged again. You're immediately able to talk or able to write the story that you left out the day before. And in that way, you sort of, it's almost like to be continued. And it does help. It helps. And the thing is, everyone assumes journalists are, you know, it's easier for them to write. It isn't, because you write for a living. And in fact, you know, I write, you know, a column in the Daily Mail, and you end up, you know, writing is a chore. It's work. So in a way, it's easier for people who don't make a living with words to write a book than it is for people who are sort of think it's, oh God, I'm getting paid to write, and I don't really want to sit down and do something extracurricular.
Very good, John. I couldn't agree with you more. Writing does become a chore when you're being paid for it.
Yeah.
As all journalists know. So coming to the book, John, let's start at the beginning. Is it in fact true that your mother once paid out €1,000 to have masses said for your salvation?
Well, my mother was an extraordinary woman, and she had 7 children, and it's only the sad thing is she died a couple of years ago, but she was remarkable in the way she thought differently from other people. I mean, she was the one, I remember when Ireland, the euro was introduced in Ireland, as it was across Europe apart from Britain in 2000. And she said to me, why didn't they wait till all the old people were dead before they brought it in? And it was quite logical. You know, her idea was that there should be a cut-off point. And
COVID-19.
Yeah, and she was very, very religious, and basically she was incredibly lucky. She was always winning that Spin the Wheel program. It's on, you know, it's attached to the Irish lottery, and she was twice on that show. Once she won £12,000, or 12,000 euros, and the second time she won about 80 or 90. But she won the second amount. I was in London, and my brother Miles, who worked at the press, called me and said, have you got a letter from our mother yet? And I said, no, not yet. And he said, I won't spoil the surprise. And a letter arrived, and it had the Sacred Heart of Jesus. He opened it like an envelope, and there was the beating heart of Jesus. And in the bottom was stamped like an official sort of communist country exit visa, with £1,000 worth of masses were being said for my soul. And you know, there must have been a priest, you know, with floodlights going like the clappers, because there were 7 of us. My late brother Heinrich, my late sister Joan, and the rest of us, who were all recipients of this wonderful gift. And I remember ringing my mother, and she said, did you get the letter? And I said, oh, such a lovely present. Oh, that's fantastic. See? And I remember at her funeral 3 years ago in the cathedral in Cavan, where we had the bishop and all the priests lined up, and I was paying a tribute to her from the pulpit. And I recounted this story, and I said, after we got this wonderful mass gift, all our marriages broke up, you know, all the boys. My brother Andrew died of a brain tumor, and my sister Joan died of terminal multiple sclerosis. And I could see the bishop shuffling, you know, that this was bad PR at a funeral, to be telling stories about the masses had absolutely no beneficial result in the case of the McEntees. But he also, for example, my father, who was a journalist as well, and he died aged 86 in 1997. And I remember leaving the family home in Cavan to go back to London. And just as I left the house, there's a priest called Father McGrath, who we all hated, he loathed them. Father McGrath arrived to pay his respects. And I passed him at the door and got into my car and I drove to the airport. And got to the airport and I called my brother Desi, who was at home at the time with my mother. And I said, "Is she all right?" He said, "You won't believe what happened. Father McGrath came in and he sat down and he drank an entire bottle of brandy. And our mother gave him £20 in cash to say a mass for the repose of the soul of Andy, our father. And Father McGrath got up, went out and dropped dead on the street. And it's a terraced house opposite the Protestant church in Cavan. And he was lying there. My mother went over to the body and went through his pockets in the hope of getting back her £20 because the mass had not been said for my father. And our next door neighbour, Mrs. Garfey, the widow of a guard, she said afterwards, "That Mrs. McEntee, she's a saint. She was trying to resuscitate the priest." No, she wasn't. She was trying to get her £20 back before the ambulance arrived. Right. And it was that sort of, frugality and also deep religious. And she really believed in the power of faith and the rest of it. But it didn't colour us so much, but she was actually tremendously religious. I mean, I remember as a child seeing my parents sitting, I don't know if it still goes on, but kneeling by their own bed in the evening saying their nightly prayers. And she, when I would return from London and would be on returning back in a hired car, she'd come running out and there'd be a tsunami of holy water thrown into the car as I tried to sort of, cheerio, cheerio. But she believed in the power of holy water. She believed in religion. And I envy that because who believes in that anymore?
Exactly. So, John, you had a happy childhood in Cavan.
I think it was. I mean, in retrospect, it was. We weren't well off, but it was a very happy childhood. And in fact, because I was the eldest of 7 in a way, I sort of felt displaced by the arrival of a younger brother, Andrich, who went into journalism as well. But it was a happy childhood. And I didn't realize until, growing up that how my father was sort of quite patrician and much older. He was at 40 when he married my mother, who was 23. And she was from a farming stock. And I hadn't really realized until well into my sort of adulthood that how unique she was, what a colourful character she was, a very popular woman. And the farm she came from, her mother, who was horrified that she would marry somebody from the town and be a journalist. And my mother recalls him saying, "Oh, why would you marry somebody from the town? Where are you going to get your food?" Because they all grew their own food. We're talking, she married in 1952. And we used to be dispatched as children out to our granny, who we adored, in Lavi. But the house, it was a lovely big farmhouse, but no running water, no toilet. And nobody ever mentioned where we should go to the toilet. We were used to at least an indoor toilet in Cavan. And it was just completely sort of embarrassing that we would not be able to do our bodily functions. And my granny was then in her 70s, and I thought, what was she doing? All she was doing, like the rest of it, was just going out into the garden and letting nature take its course. And it was one extraordinary event. My uncle, Johnny Cusick, was a quite legendary Gaelic footballer. He's one of the last surviving, I think he's probably the last surviving player who won the All-Ireland for Cavan in the 50s. And Johnny was a bachelor at that time, and he was sort of in charge of the house. And I remember my 3 brothers and I were sharing what to call a huge, not so much a settled bed, but a big old sprung bed in the upstairs bedroom. And we had a commode, an old-fashioned commode, and all of us answered the call of nature during the night. And I, being the oldest, got up really early thinking that I'd just dispose of this. It's too embarrassing to mention. You never actually mention a bodily function. So I then decided to throw it all out the window. And in those days, it still is probably in farms, the front street or the front of the house was very rarely used as, people didn't come to the front of the house. They came around the back street. So I threw all this stuff out, and I didn't realize my uncle was having his boiled egg downstairs before he went out to sort of save the hay. And we were all lying in bed, and my uncle Johnny came thundering upstairs. We were all then pretending to be asleep. And he said, right, who threw the shit out the window? And he kicked the bed, and we all just rose up in the air, and I confessed. And I was taken out and had to sort of scrape all this nonsense out of the walls and the floor and the rest of it. And then a week later, my cousin, Father Johnny Cusick, who's still alive, he had just been ordained in Maynooth. And in those days, you had what they call a spree, a party to celebrate the ordination. It was much more fundamental in the country than somebody getting a doctorate or becoming a surgeon. So I'm there with my sort of hair oil hair and wandering around and being patted on the head and getting 2 shillings here and a shilling there from all my uncles. And then Johnny, my uncle, just pulled me over by the ear to the priest. And he said, "Here's the guy who threw the shit out the window." And I was absolutely mortified. I was about 8 years old. And I thought the most humiliating thing to happen was to be outed for something that was a necessary thing to do, but maybe not handled very well. They have a toilet now, by the way.
Yeah. And so, John, how did you get into journalism? Was it the influence of your father?
It was, alas. I mean, I wasn't a particularly bright pupil at St. Patrick's College. I had a really tough leaving. And luckily, my father was deputy editor of a local paper, which is still going strong, called the Anglo Celt. And we had a long family tradition of being my grandfather worked there and my uncles. And at a loose end, he got me, first of all, I was working as a sort of a trainee photographer during the holidays and covering Gaelic football matches, standing at the goal trying to get a picture. And then he then got me in as a junior reporter, which meant that I had to go to the local tech to learn typing and shorthand. And annoyingly, because I'd been to a boarding school, I was completely incapable of sort of dealing with the opposite sex. And there were all the girls who were my age, which is probably, I think, 18. They were much more mature. In fact, they were younger than that, but women and girls are always much more mature than men. And the teacher would say, "Oh, John's going to be a journalist. He can spell this word." And it was excruciating trying to learn shorthand and typing in this environment. But, you know, again, it was, I suppose, nepotism. That I don't know what would have happened if I was trying to get a job other than the fact that my father had these connections in the newspaper.
And how did your career in the Anglo South go?
Well, I wasn't there that long. I was there about 2 years. You had to do the Cavan news items and the Alva and Kilishandra notes. And it's a different age. I used to have to go around to all these towns and see the local butcher or the local baker or the local woman who ran the bridge club and get little snippets, which became the notes in the newspaper. And only a generation before, my father was telling me that, you know, for example, at funerals, you were sent to get the names of all the mourners, and the mourners, you would get paid a shilling for each mourner in there because they'd all buy the newspaper. And it was like a huge blitz of names. And in a way, that's all gone now. The whole sort of local tradition of having your name in the newspaper, or maybe photographs or whatever. But it was.
So from there you made it to Dublin.
I got a job in the Irish Press in 1972, and the press was recruiting. And in fact, I started on the same day that a guy you know, Michael Sharkey from Derry. We both started on the very same day, and the chief news editor, Mick O'Kane, who was sort of a paternal figure, we had nothing to do on the first day, so he put us into the little box, the sort of nighttime, daytime box, listening to the police radio, just because there was no work for us. And Mick and I were vying for it, running over to Mick at the news desk, saying, "Oh, there's a car being stolen in Sherrill Street." We were so excited with this new sort of aura of really, really big stories. And they weren't big stories. We were just police radios we were monitoring. And it was like sort of vagrants falling down on O'Connell Bridge. And it was very, very ordinary. But at that time, the press was, the evening press in particular, which was part of the group, was the predominant Dublin evening newspaper. And the Sunday press was the largest selling paper in Ireland before the Sunday World sort of took that mantle. And the Irish press never made any money, but it was very much a political organ of Fianna Fáil. And I remember we were never allowed to describe Northern Ireland as Northern Ireland. It was either the 6 counties or the occupied part of Ireland. You know, it was part of the journalese that this nationalist newspaper would never admit that we weren't going to get Northern Ireland back at some stage.
Right. And then you moved on to London, working still for the Irish Press.
Well, it was odd. There was a lovely girl called Diane Shanto who helped me greatly later on. And Diane Shanto worked in the London office. We had a small office in Fleet Street opposite the Telegraph. And they wanted to train Diane. She really wasn't attuned to the way the press worked. So they took her over to London, to Dublin for 6 months. And Mick O'Kane asked, would I go to London for 6 months? And I did. And I've never gone back. But the point was, at that time, it wasn't particularly, I didn't really want to go to London because, you know, here we were in Dublin. Our salaries had just gone up a bit. I had a car I'd bought on HP, living in a flat in Palmerston Road. And of course, Dublin in those days, it may be the same now, but because of the huge number of ladies working in the civil service, there was like 10 available women for every man. And it was an extraordinary sort of time when if you had a few bob and the city was sort of open to that, and the job was going well in Burgh Quay. And it was a shock to be sent to London, which is huge. I mean, I remember my mother saying, you've got to go out and see your uncle in Whipps Cross. And I had no idea that Whipps Cross was almost halfway to Cavan from Dublin. The sheer scale of the city meant that you were unbelievably sort of overpowered by it. But the great excitement for me was that you could do what you liked in London, because London, in those days, celebrities, whether they were promoting a movie or a book, wouldn't make the trip to Dublin. So all of these people would turn up in London, Norman Mailer or Paul Newman or whatever, Betty Davis, and you had access to them. And it was very, very exciting. And there was also a culture in Dublin then, which if you were seen in Burgh Quay to be keen to do extra stuff, like if you were interested in music and you wanted to do reviews, it was sneered at. You were sort of somehow an apple polisher. Whereas in London, you were liberated from that. You could do what you like. So you basically were supplying the evening press in the morning with stories, and you were supplying the Irish press in the afternoon with stories, and the Sunday press. But in the meantime, you could do these interviews, you could meet people, and it broadened me totally. And it was very, very fulfilling. In fact, in a way...
Who's your favorite interviewee?
I think it was Jimmy Stewart. I mean, there was something incredibly humble about Stewart. He was promoting a sort of shoot of the Philadelphia story, and he was staying in Claridge's. And he, you know, myself and the photographer went in to ask for him, and he was sitting up in his own suite. There was none of this sort of paraphernalia now of 20 sort of minders, and we just sat and talked forever, and there was no sort of pressure on, right, you've done your hour, get out. And it was quite impressive. And you see, I think the bigger the star was, less likely they were to be upset by not having an entourage, which sort of gave them credibility or gave them some feeling of superiority.
Your relationships with celebrities didn't always go so smoothly, did they? I'm thinking of Richard Harris, for example.
Oh dear. Well, unfortunately, I remember I interviewed Harris quite a few times, but one particular interview, he was staying in a hotel promoted by his then wife, his divorced wife, Elizabeth, who's still alive. She's now married to Jonathan Aitken. He was staying in Halcyon, and I went with a photographer, and Harris was perfect. He was in his underpants, and he was chasing a girl around the bedroom who was trying to do his bed. He was full of copy. But then the great mistake was that he disclosed that his son Jared is now a huge star in Chernobyl and Mad Men. That Jared was then in rehab in America somewhere, and he said, "This is off the record." And of course, at that stage, I was sort of flogging stories to supplement my income, and I flogged a story to the Daily Star. And of course, Harris sued, and it was the most bizarre suing. He sued not because it wasn't true, but because it was off the record. And the Daily Star was owned by the Express at the time, and the owner of the Express had they just lost a huge amount of money, the Daily Star, from Jeffrey Archer's libel case with Monica Coughlin. So they wanted a victory. So they went to court. They asked me would I give evidence. And I, like, stupidly said I would, considering that I was working for the Irish Press in Dublin. And of course, went into the High Court, and Harris was sitting in the court, and all the stuff from the interview came out about running around. It made it very interesting for the British papers about, you know, my interviews read out about him chasing this chambermaid around the room, and then I had to give evidence, and the nightmare was Harris would sit in the pool of the court staring up at me, and the counsel for Harris said, "Mr. McEntee, how much did you get for this tittle tattle?" And I said, £30, Your Honour. And he said, and he looked at the jury and he said, 30 pieces of silver. And I knew we were finished. And the second thing was that the Express Star stupidly tried to nail Harris as a supporter of the IRA. This is now in the late 70s. The troubles were big time. And they claimed that he was a supporter of NORAD. He spent most of his time in New York. And Harris said, "You're mistaken." He said, "I denounce NORAD. And as a result, I'm under sentence of death and I can't visit my mother in Limerick." And he started to cry. And I looked over and there were 3 of the jurors crying at the same time. And I said, "We're not going to win this case." And of course, we settled out of court after 2 days for 80,000 quid. And it was extraordinary, as I said. It wasn't about the fact that it wasn't true. It was, though Harris and I didn't see each other for about 10 years. And then I was, there was a pub called the Coal Hole next to the Savoy, and Harris was living in the Savoy. And I had some well-refreshed lunch, and I went into I wanted to buy a Mother's Day card. I went into Clinton Cards on the Strand, bought a Mother's Day card, decided to go into the Coal Hole, have a beer and write a card to my mother and send her a couple of quid. Went in, and there was Harris, who lived in the Coal Hole. He was very lonely in the last few years of his life. And he looked over my over his glass and saw me walk into the bar. And we hadn't seen each other since we were in court. And I thought I should really go over and say something. So I went over and I said, "Are you speaking to me?" And he said, "Of course I am. Come on. I got 80,000 quid off you." So I sat down, and I never forget, we had about 4 pints of Boddington each. And he saw the Mother's Day card and he said, "What's that?" And I said, "It's my Mother's Day card." And he said, "How much are you sending your mother?" And I said, "Oh, I might send her a check for £50. And he said, "Yeah, send her 100. So anyway, I said, "We wrote a check for 100, put it in." And he then decided to take the card and write a huge message to her. And of course, the card was just covered in beer stains. There's rings all over the card and the envelope. Sent it off to my mother. And I rang her a few days later and said, "Did you get the card?" And she said, "Yeah, but I can't understand a word of it. It's gibberish." And I said, "Oh, it's Richard Harris." "Oh, isn't he lovely?" She couldn't. The check was fine. But then subsequently, Harris and I became very good friends. We would have a drink in the Coal Hole, and he was very lonely. He'd invite me up to the suite to watch Chelsea, his favourite team. And then there was one extraordinary day I went in, and I'd had an invitation to a Penguin book party for Frank McCourt, who'd written Angela's Ashes. And Frank McCourt had sold 1 million copies in paperback of his book. And I said to Richard, I took out the invitation because Penguin was only around the corner from the Strand. And I said, why don't you come to this party? He's from Limerick. And he said, "A chancer." And I said, "What do you mean he's a chancer?" He said, "I'll tell you about him. And he told me the story that when Harris was singing Camelot, he was touring America in the musical Camelot. And McCourt, his brother Frank, and I can't remember the second.
Malachy.
The two of them were sort of knockabout lecturers in Manhattan, and they were drinking a lot, the rest of it. And their mother was Angela, and Harris told me that they used to do this cabaret show in bars, talking about their childhood and their impoverishment in Limerick. And Angela, the mother, used to go to these dudes and shout from the back of the room, "Lies, lies, it wasn't like that." And eventually, when she died, Harris said that they wanted to ship her ashes back to Limerick. And he he gave McCourt the money to ship the ashes back, and she basically he lost the ashes. You know, he went to, according to Harris, he went to a cheap shipper in Queens who lost the ashes. And he said, you go to that party, this is Harris, you go to that party around the corner and you ask Frank McCourt what happened to his mother's ashes. So I said, that's fine, went round the corner, and McCourt was being lionized by all these young girls from, I know mostly girls from publishing, all listening to these dreadful stories about, you know, having to eat nothing and, you know, cutting a pea in four, you know, to have their dinner. And I went up and introduced myself. I was working for the Daily Express at the time, and I said, oh, Frank, I'm John McEntee from the Daily Express. He was very friendly. And I said, I'd just like to ask you one question. What happened to your mother's ashes? And his face just dropped, and he grabbed me by the throat and he pushed me up against the wall and said, Harris sent you. Harris, it's fucking Richard Harris, isn't it? And I said, well, yeah, he did mention it. And I was thrown out of the party. You know, they thought that I was offending the star author. And a week later, I went back into the coal hole, and there was Harris again sipping his Boddingtons. And I went over and I said, you nearly got me killed. And he said, what happened? And I told him the story. He could not contain his glee. So I told you, he's the chancer. He's the chancer. He lost his mother's ashes. Yeah, you know. Anyway, I think it was about 2001 or 2002. Harris had died. And again, just as a footnote, Harris had late success in Harry Potter, and he would have hated the headline in The Sun, Dumbledore is dead. He would have hated that sort of, you know, considering all the great movies he made. But anyway, the Irish Embassy had a party for Frank's last book, Teacher Man, and he was doing a reading. I can't remember who the ambassador was. So I went along, and he finished his reading, and I went up and introduced myself again. He said, I know you. And I said, you know, you had me thrown out, you strangled me. And he said, you're right, we did lose the ashes. I said, but in fact, what happened was, it wasn't a cheap shipper. Maliki and I had too much to drink, and we left my mother's ashes in the bar in Manhattan.
Wow. So
so Harris was right.
Story? Did you write the story? John, did you write the story?
I did write it, but also I do miss Harris. Harris was character, and he went too young, and he was a great source of, you know, he was one of the sort of, nowadays it's sort of, there's so many famous Irish actors, but he was in that vanguard of O'Toole and himself, long before, you know, the Irish were sort of a byword for sort of talent and Hollywood.
Did you come across O'Toole? I think O'Toole gets a mention in your book as well. Huh?
Yeah, O'Toole, I used to say O'Toole loved the Oldie magazine, and O'Toole, he again was one of these people who had started drinking again in his last years. You know, he'd been off the drink for about 20 years, and then suddenly he started to enjoy a drink again, just as Harris did. I don't know what the logic of it was, but there's an English actor who he was very fond of. His name will come to me in a moment. He always helped out. I wish I could remember his name.
Was it Ronnie Dawson?
No, it was Ronnie, not Ronnie Dawson. It was Ronnie, I can't think of his second name, but Ronnie came on hard times in his last years. And O'Toole used to appear in a program that Chris Evans ran called Don't Forget Your Toothbrush. And O'Toole used to do recitals pretending he was King Lear. And he always got Ronnie, again, name will come to me, but he always got Ronnie a gig, as it were. But there's a great story. He was.
John, keep close to the microphone if you can. When you move to the left or right, the sound goes a bit.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
No worries.
Yeah, but they used to smoke dope in Ronnie's flat in Maida Vale, and there's a great story about the two of them being quite drunk, and after a session in a local pub, and they were going home to Ronnie's to smoke some dope, and they were stopped by a policeman and said, "Are you all right, you two?" And he said, "That's fine." And he said, Ronnie said, "Do you have a sniffer dog?" And he said, we do. Could we borrow it? And he said, "What do you mean borrow it?" Because he knew too, Lawrence of Arabia, he thought, God. starstruck policeman. And Ronnie said, yes, it's just that I've lost my stash at home and maybe your dog could find it for me.
Very good. There's another fantastic story about Tommy Cooper in the book, John.
Tommy, oh God. See, Tommy...
Explain who Tommy was for our younger listeners.
Tommy Cooper was this, a stand-up comedian who wore a fez, and he was a legend in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. He was probably the biggest name in comedy. He had a lot of TV shows, Tommy Cooper's Hour, Tommy. He was also a magician who claimed that he was useless. He always made the tricks look like they were a mess. And in fact, he was a very, very talented magician. And I'm trying to think of the year he died. He died very strangely. He was starring in in Her Majesty's Theatre, a live show on ITV, and he died on stage. He just collapsed, and they pulled the curtains, and you could see his boots or his shoes on the stage, and it was completely unexpected, and nobody knew. Jimmy Tarbuck was the compere, a well-known Liverpudlian comedian, and he had to say, "Oh, I'm very sorry, we didn't say Tommy had died," but they had to cut the whole show, and because it was live, it was a bit of a mess. But at that stage, the years, probably in the early 80s, the Irish press, which I worked for still, was always going on strike. You'd get a phone call from Dublin, down tools, and there'd be in the end, ultimately, the paper, as you know, folded in 1994 because of all this endless industrial action. And I used to sort of watch shifts of the Sun, the red top tabloid, which is only around the corner from the office. And in those days, Fleet Street was a village where you kept bumping into, you could get work very easily because you kept bumping into various people in different newspapers in the pubs. And I was then dispatched by the news editor of the Sun to go to Tommy's house in, I'd never forget, Bishopsgate Road in Chiswick, lovely 6-bedroom Tudor house, to interview his widow, Dove. And when I arrived, there was a whole pile of journalists sort of hovering outside the house and nothing. So I decided to go into Chiswick, and I remember going to Chiswick and having 3 pints of London Pride, and then I bought 50 quid's worth of flowers, a lot of flowers, went back, and there was no sign of any other competitor. So I went up to the door, and a Filipino maid came out. She said, no, Mrs. Cooper, she see nobody. So Dove came out, and she looked over. I didn't realize that she was plastered, but she leaned over the head of the maid and said, "Oh, what lovely flowers!" And then she said, "Oh, you're Irish. Come in." And I was brought into the inner sanctum, into the house. And the first thing I noticed, as this wonderful house, an open plan hall, was this huge trunk, which was Tommy's props from the night before, and all his stuff that he'd been using. And on top of it was a half-eaten loaf of bread, which were banana sandwiches, which I will come to in a moment. So she insisted that I come and watch the video of Tommy dying on stage. So I had to mix drinks for myself and her, a couple of gin and tonics. And we sat down, and again, she froze when Tommy laughed. She burst into tears. And then she pointed at the sandwiches and said, every night that Tommy would go to work, he would take a whole loaf of banana sandwiches. He's only eaten half of them. And then she started to cry again. And then she asked me, the phone was ringing constantly. And she said, will you deal with the phone? And it was people like Michael Parkinson and Eric Morecambe, Eric Sykes, all asking to speak to her. And I said, no, Mrs. Cooper is not, she's not in a position, she's indisposed. And she was crying away. And who was that? And I said, that was Eric Sykes. Oh. Anyway, she asked me then to bring the trunk, carry the trunk up the stairs. And there's a huge, very big pushing it up. It was a bit like Laurel and Hardy and the piano. And I got it up the stairs, and I realized that every single room, apart from the master bedroom, was full of props like, guillotines, arrows through your head. Tommy had the house full of jokes, as it were. Got the props sorted, and then she insisted on bringing me out to the back of the house where there was an extension which had been built for her son, Tommy Jr., who had died before him. And she was showing me all the facilities. And I opened a cupboard which you put plates or something in. And there was a complete cascade of tsunamis can pour, or not say a cascade of tsunamis, cascade of fezzes, all different sizes that Tommy used to wear. And again, burst into tears. And it was really, really bizarre. I spent about 3 hours with her. And eventually I went back to the office, and Tom Petrie, the news editor, said to me, where have you been? And I said, I've been doorstepping. And I really hadn't the heart to say I'd been, she was vulnerable. I could have written a great story for the Sun about my time with Mrs. Cooper. And I only wrote it after she died because, it wasn't a surreal experience. And she's dead now as well. But it wouldn't have been right to have scribbled down a story about a woman who was really in great distress.
Well done, John. Very good call on that. How come you didn't afford the same respect to the Pope when he visited Ireland?
Well, I did actually. In fairness, it wasn't disrespect to the Pope. It was 1979, and I was in London, but like all the newspapers were geared up for this amazing. It was the first visit of a Pope to Ireland ever. I mean, they had a Eucharistic Congress in 1931 or 32 that my parents used to talk about. But to have actually Pope John Paul II arrived, and he did Dublin, he went as far as Newry, and then I was assigned to his Mass for the Sick in Knock, the Basilica, where the Virgin Mary allegedly turned up in 1852. And there's a wonderful basilica built by Monsignor Moran, the man who built the airport. And so I turned up, and at the last minute they said, no, we're closed. We're not allowing the media into this mass. It's a private mass for the terminally ill. And I there was a pub nearby, and I was having a few beers, and I hired a wheelchair, which for 20 quid, and I got a local to wheel me in with a rug over me into the mass for the ill. And of course, the Pope was very late because he was in Galway officiating over the famous Mass for the Youth with Bishop Casey and that other chancellor, Father Michael Cleary, is it? And they were very, very late. So what happened was everybody was getting stark crazy, and around the altar in the basilica next to me and I suddenly had second thoughts because there were people on drips and beds, and obviously very, very ill. And there was a local group of women who were like sort of quasi-nurses called the Handmaidens of the Lord. And they were all the sort of bargers, the people who play bridge and golf. And they were all wearing these sort of semi-religious nurses' outfits, blue with a crucifix. And the helicopter we could hear above, and Monsignor Horan said, the Holy Father is about to land. And all of the handmaids of the Lord lunged forward and blocked the view of the ill, even me in my wheelchair. And Father Moran said, will the handmaidens of the Lord please move back so that the sick people can see the Holy Father? Would they budge? And he brought in a whole battalion of curates who were beating these women, pushing them back beyond the rim of the first step on the altar. And anyway, the Holy Father arrives, and at that stage I thought, I'd been there for a couple of hours, and the 4 pints of Guinness was beginning to sort of have its effect. I was bursting for a pee, basically. So the Holy Father, he did his mass, and he was very charismatic. It was just before he was shot in Rome, where a lot of energy was drained out of him. But he was just like a rock star. People of Ireland, I love you. He did his mass, and he then came round and sort of chatted to all the ill people, and then he came to me and shook hands with me, and I felt like saying, any chance wheeling me out for a tea. And eventually he went on. I did get out in time with steam rising around me outside the basilica, but it was something I probably, if I was a bit more mature, I mightn't have done, but I did.
Yeah. Anyway, John, what's your take on Fleet Street today, after spending 40 years in the
Well,
game?
it's different. I mean, I had the best of it, really, because I moved on from working down to become a gossip columnist. I was William Hickey on the Express, and I ran various columns. I'm still doing a column in the Mail, but the whole sort of culture of sort of drinking and expenses and meeting people is gone. It's now become a culture of people, reading screens. I mean, the Mail Online, which is an online operation, is the biggest in the world. It's got an incredible audience. But the people who work on it are all mostly girls who earn probably about 22,000 a year after doing a degree and then onwards to a journalistic course. And you cannot afford to live in London on £22,000 a year. So it's become a rich person's game where your parents are either subsidising you in a flat, or you're somehow being helped out, because in my time, you would graduate from a local newspaper like I did, move on to a national newspaper, and then sort of imperceptibly maybe your salary would go up as you became either a political reporter, a sports reporter, specialist, and you would be earning a very decent salary. In the case of, say, the Mail, there are one or two of them left, would be maybe you'd be earning sort of 80 or 90,000, and it's the same in Ireland. But they're the dying breed. My generation have been sort of more or less moved on, and it's all of these younger people who are just taking stuff out of magazines and rewriting stuff. And there isn't the same personal contact. You don't actually go out and meet people. I mean, I tend to, because I was obviously a gossip columnist, you go to parties where you meet people, you establish a relationship with them. You might be able to call them up afterwards. That culture is gone. And I also think, depressingly, that it's this huge lockdown, almost world lockdown, is going to change it's going to change the profession even more, because the Daily Mail, for example, they will question why the need to have a hugely expensive building in Fleet Street when everybody's working from home and their rents are enormous for this building. They will probably have a rethink and say, well, we don't need all these, A, we don't need all these people, and B, we don't need this expensive office. We can do it as we are at the moment. I'm sitting at this very computer writing a column instead of being in the office.
And how do you manage that? I mean, Howard, we have a question from a listener online asking, how is the COVID-19 outbreak affecting the working life of journalists in Fleet Street?
Well, I mean, basically we got it's not a scoop. We all got a letter from Lord Rothermere today saying that in view of the crisis, that people have been asked if they take a salary cut, between 1% and 26%, depending on your salary. Anybody over 40,000 a year would be asked to take this cut, and in lieu of money, they would be given shares in the Daily Mail, which they can cash next year, which is quite a radical and I think sensible thing, considering that the Evening Standard, which is the great flagship evening newspaper, that's more or less made every member of staff redundant, and I don't think it's going to come out afterwards because it's a free newspaper. So it has a huge effect on newspapers because advertising is dried up. I mean, the Daily Mail, for example, in the normal circumstances, has £5 million worth of travel ads, cruises, every week. That's gone, because the travel industry is completely in free fall. So there are going to be huge repercussions, but ultimately, to answer the question, it's very easy actually to run a newspaper from home. The subs, I sent my copy an hour ago to a sub who's sitting at home. He would then get a picture via somebody on the picture desk from home, and the lawyers are at home. So it's a very easy. The editor reads it. He would then say to me, "Fine, take out that story about Glenda Jackson," as he did today. So you're ultimately able to do it. But I think the longer this goes on, the more damaging it will be, not just to newspapers, but to all economies, all people working.
Yeah, I think to some extent you've answered this question that comes in from Pádraig Rooney, who's in fact on our show last week, our first show. He's a great poet and short story writer from Monaghan.
Indeed.
He says, a cascade of fezzes is a wonderful phrase and a great anecdote. Do you think, John, that the role of journalism has declined in recent years? And if so, is it irrevocable?
It's more frivolous, but then I think they're always, I'm quite frankly a frivolous journalist. I'm not, the only real journalism I ever did was work covering things like, the murders in Gibraltar or the bombing, where you were actually a real reporter. I'm in sort of, since then, more or less in the amusement industry. But to answer Paul's question, I'm not sure if it's declined. There are still really good journalists, and who will uncover and disclose, and see people doing bad things and highlight it. So I think journalism is safe in that respect. I mean, even the Mail has an investigation team who have discovered quite a few things about the way the banks operate, and there'll always be space for that sort of real journalism, alongside the sort of nonsense that I'm involved in.
Last question here from Ken Curran, asking how do you approach memoir writing in terms of how many ideas would you try to cram into one chapter, or how do you structure your approach? I think he's asking.
Well, I think in a way it's probably best to do it chronologically. But what I tended to do was I'd remember things. I didn't keep early diaries or anything, but I just jot down something that some story that would have happened when I was 12, 13, 14 or onwards, and try to weave it into the narrative. But I think the sensible thing to do is try and do it chronologically. Just start at the start and move on. And a lot of it, would probably not be that hugely interesting, because everybody's got an interesting life, but it's trying to pick out the things that are interesting. And of course, there is another problem, is that a lot of the interesting things would offend your family and would cause upset. So you have to be self-editing, in the sense you don't want to fall out with your brothers or your cousins or whatever.
Well,
and
did you fall out with many people as a result of some of the very candid tales you told?
One or two, and in fact, one story which I got wrong is a dear cousin of mine, Michael, who was an antique dealer, and he was shot in Stephen's Green when he was staying with me, and I was on the press, and I named I was told that the guy who shot him was a neighbour of ours from Calvin. I got it wrong. Luckily, the guy who did it is dead, but because Michael never spoke about it. And then when the book came out, he said, "You got it completely wrong. He didn't shoot me." I said, "Who did?" He said, "I'm not telling you."
John, listen, we'll close with this. The question from Mike Hollingsworth. I know
Mike.
I have a copy of John's book. I couldn't put it down. I expected it to be a compilation of stories of various celebrities, but aside from that, it turned out to be an absolutely fascinating story of a young man's life growing up in Ireland. Could listen to him all night. What's left to do now for you, John? He says.
I don't know. It's I always say that when I'm giving birthday greetings to people, I'm still playing in the first half. So who knows? I don't know. It's but I do enjoy chatting, as you know.
You certainly do. John, are you going out on the street now to applaud your health workers in Britain?
No, it's not tonight. It's not tonight. No, it's not tonight.
Well, we do apparently it every night here.
There's a very funny debate going on here about the new 5 network. Apparently, people think that it's causing the virus, and they've set fire to some of the platforms or the towers in Liverpool. And the belief is that this causing the virus. And I heard on the radio this morning on James O'Brien show, he was saying that they're saying that there's a huge noise of static electricity that is being deliberately covered up by the clapping. So when people are clapping, they're disguising this weird noise that's coming from these masts. It's complete nonsense. So don't do this at home.
We certainly won't. Well, John, here in Geneva, we all go out on the balcony or out on the street at this hour to applaud the health workers here. It happens every night. Every night? Yeah. And we're only allowed to do it. I mean, then Boris did it on what day is today? He did it a night or two ago, and look what's happened. He's in hospital. So, John, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Same to you. And lovely to see you again. Yeah. Take care, John. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks everyone for tuning in. Talk to you next week. Bye.
Bye.
On.